Lightweight, baby!
What's up guys, I'm Josh and I Live Things, and I'm here to talk about training to failure. Is it necessary or overrated? In this video I'm going to go over some definitions and try to clear up some misconceptions a lot of people have about training to failure, and then I will cover the most pertinent literature on this topic. Finally, at the end I'm going to give some practical applications, so make sure you stick around to see that. So this is a wildly heated debate, and a more recent meta-analysis actually added a lot of fuel to this fire. Here is what we know. Training is the stimulus, and getting bigger and stronger is the adaptation to said stimulus. From this base truth, two camps seem to emerge. Some camps stated that more is more, so more training is more stimulus, which would lead to more adaptation. This turned out to be true, but only to a certain extent. Thanks to things like systemic fatigue and people having not so great of lifestyles where they aren't meticulously tracking their recovery in the form of sleep and diet or everything else, people start to dig too deep into the recovery debt. This results in something like overreaching and then eventually overtraining. At the end of the day, this is a net negative for hypertrophy. It seems that there's sort of a Goldilocks zone where if you don't get close enough to failure, you're wasting your time, and if you get too close to failure, you may be risking injury. Failure in and of itself is a pretty nebulous term anyways. There are two main forms of failure: mechanical failure and absolute failure. Mechanical failure is when you can no longer perform another rep with good, safe form. All things being equal, this is typically as far as you should take a set, especially on a free weight compound barbell movement. Continuing a heavy deadlift when you are too gassed to actually keep a proper brace is always a bad idea. Absolute failure, on the other hand, is even with cheat reps or even some definitions partials, you cannot complete another rep. For isolation movements, it's probably safer to actually take those movements to this absolute failure, even if you're probably going to be bringing in other muscle groups that aren't really required to do the movement you're trying, somewhat ruining the idea of an isolation movement in the first place. For instance, if you have to do a fucking backflip to get another curl up, you're probably curling too heavy or going too far. That being said, this is all just momentary failure. If you wait long enough after reaching failure, you could probably still get another rep or two. This means that now when you're trying to figure out your actual failure point, you have to start bringing rest periods into the equation, which just further muddies the water. Now, before I get into the science of everything, I would like to bring up a term that confuses a lot of people, which is intensity. To be exact, especially with how the vast majority of the literature references the word intensity, it is purely referring to how close to your 1 rep max you are training. This means if your 1 rep max on bench press was 200 pounds and you did a set of bench with 100 pounds, you were training with an intensity of 50%. Some people will do a set and claim, oh, that was a really intense set, when it really wasn't. You could curl a 1-pound dumbbell 100 times, and that would be a very hard set. You would be very sore and very gassed and have a crazy pump. But it was not a high intensity set. Think about it. If you could do 100 reps in one set, it was a very low weight relative to your 1 rep max. This is purely just a problem with linguistics and people thinking intense means hard, but when you're talking about just a hard set, the training variable that we are referencing is actually effort. That 100 curl set was a high effort set, but a low intensity set. For us, this means that training to failure could be high intensity if you used very few reps because it was such a high weight, or it could be very low intensity but very high effort. Now that that common misconception is cleared up, let's move on to some of the science actually surrounding this topic. Before we dive into purely seeing how good approaching failure is for hypertrophy or strength, let's first talk about the fact that people are awful at actually estimating how close to failure they are. Here we have estimating repetitions in reserve for resistance exercise, an analysis of factors which impact a prediction accuracy. 20 men were assessed for their 1 rep max on bench and a row before being randomized into control, i.e. informed on the load, or blinded, non-informed. They then completed 2 protocols in randomized order, 3 sets at 80% 1 rep max, 3 sets at 60% 1 rep max. During each set of these protocols, subjects were asked to estimate their reps in reserve before continuing the set to failure. Differences in estimated and actual RIR between sets and conditions were determined via a 3-way repeated measure analysis of the variance. No differences in RIR accuracy were observed between blinded versus non-blinded conditions. Repetitions in reserve estimates were lower than actual RIR for the first set of both exercises and 60 and 80% protocols. and for set 2 of the 80% bench press control. The ability to accurately determine RIR in the 60 and 80% 1-rep max protocols improved from sets 1 to 3, indicating that estimation of RIR is enhanced when an individual is estimating RIR at a closer point to actual failure. It seems like you can get better at predicting this with more training, hence why beginners are just bad at auto-regulation, which has been a proven point time and time again that I have touched on multiple times in multiple videos. Changes in intra-set repetitions in reserve prediction accuracy during 6 weeks of bench press training in trained men. RIR rating accuracy did not significantly improve over time, though there was a greater tendency to underestimate RIR in later sessions and during higher repetition sets. Turns out you maybe can't get all that better at least over the period of 6 weeks. Your prediction of RIR, or how close to failure you are, seems to get worse during a high repetition set. Here we have a landmark meta-analysis on the very subject, Accuracy in Predicting Repetitions to Task Failure in Resistance Exercise, a scoping review and exploratory meta-analysis. The main multi-level meta-analysis model, including all effect sizes, revealed that participants tended to underpredict the number of repetitions to task failure by 0.95 repetitions. Meta-regression showed that prediction accuracy slightly improved when the predictions were made closer to set failure and when the number of repetitions performed to task failure was lower. Set number trivially influenced prediction accuracy with slight increased accuracy in later sets. In contrast, participants' training status did not seem to influence prediction accuracy, and neither did the implementation of upper or lower body exercises. Furthermore, there was minimal between participant variation in predictive accuracy, with a standard deviation of 1.45 repetitions and a 95% confidence interval. Now, a lot of the quote-unquote high-intensity or two-failure proponents like to say that people are awful at estimating how close to failure they actually are. You may think that people have an awful time at guessing where failure actually is, but it seems to be less overblown than it is made out to be, about 1 rep short. And as sets go on, especially if they are of lower reps, it's easier to predict when your actual failure point is. Now let's move on to the actual literature surrounding training to failure and hypertrophy. Here we have the effects of resistance training performed to failure or not to failure on muscle strength, hypertrophy, and power output, a systematic review with meta-analysis. From the discussion section, we can see here, overall analyses indicated no differences between training to failure and training not to failure with regard to training-induced gains in maximal strength and power output outcomes. When considering studies that consisted of non-equalized volume in resistance training, we observed an association between not failure with greater maximal strength and muscle power increase in comparison with training to failure. But again, that was for non-volume equated training. Furthermore, they observed an association between training to failure with greater muscle hypertrophy when compared with not failure when non-equalized resistance training volumes. However, this difference was not found in the analysis when taking into account only studies that equalized the training volume. This would lead us to believe that when all volume is equalized, meaning the same amount of hard sets per week, no matter if you were training to failure or not to failure, which I'm sure all the studies using this meta-analysis use different definitions of that, it seemed to elicit similar hypertrophy. Here they talk about how training to failure could optimize neuromuscular improvement compared with RTNF based on size principle or Henneman's size principle of motor unit recruitment. Only a few studies have confirmed this in isoinertial strength outcomes, whereas most found no difference on strength increase. In addition, a meta-analysis by Davies et al., who subsequently published erratum, did not confirm differences between failure and not failure on strength enhancement. From the practical applications, strength and conditioning coaches should be aware that training to failure and training not to failure induce comparable improvements in maximal strength and muscle power output in athletes and non-athletes, and even a small advantage of not failure can maybe be observed in strength increase, particularly when considering lower body muscles. Regarding muscle hypertrophy, it seems that RTF promotes greater muscle size gains, but these gains are related to a greater resistance training volume rather than any influence of transient induced fatigue across the sets, as can be observed in the absence of differences between training to failure and not failure when considering equalized resistance training volumes. Therefore, training to failure is widely used. It should also consider the risks. Here's another review and meta-analysis, the effects of resistance training performed at repetition failure or non-failure on muscle strength and hypertrophy. From the highlights, there was no significant difference between resistance training to failure versus non-failure on strength and hypertrophy. There was no significant difference between training conditions and subgroup analyses that stratified the studies according to body region, exercise selection, and study design. When considering studies that did not equate training volume between the groups, the analysis showed significant favoring of non-failure training on strength gains. Additionally, in the subgroup analysis for resistance trained individuals, the analysis showed a significant effective training of failure for muscle hypertrophy. Again, when volume is not equated. Here's influence of resistance training proximity to failure on skeletal muscle hypertrophy, a systematic review with meta-analysis. Given the variability in set failure definitions applied across studies, subgroup analysis were conducted and found no advantage for either resistance training performed to momentary muscle failure versus non-failure for muscle hypertrophy, or for resistance training performed to high versus moderate velocity loss thresholds. To touch on that, some studies to measure actual failure or proximity to failure, they talk about the velocity in which the bar moves. So for your first couple of reps, the bar will be moving quite fast because you're not fatigued, and as the set goes on longer, the bar speed slows down. Again, with no moderating effect of volume load or relative load, there was a slight enhancement for training to failure versus not failure for muscle hypertrophy when they aren't equating for volume. Here's an interesting study. Muscle failure promotes greater muscle hypertrophy in low load, but not in high load resistance training. This is just interesting to know, just in case maybe you are going through a rehab routine. Maybe you have an injury. There are ways to increase muscle activation and perhaps hypertrophy gains when you are training in a fatigued state, or if you have some reason to not increase load too much. This study here, the effect of resistance training to muscle failure versus non-failure on strength, hypertrophy, and muscle architecture in trained individuals from the biology of sport. It essentially says that no significant differences in EMG amplitude were detected between protocols. In conclusion, resistance training to failure and resistance training to not failure are similarly effective in promoting increases in muscle mass. Here we have towards an improved understanding of proximity to failure in resistance training and its influence on skeletal muscle hypertrophy, neuromuscular fatigue, muscle damage, and perceived discomfort, a scoping review. A massive key point here, there is no consensus definition for set failure in resistance training, and the proximity to failure achieved during non-failure resistance training is often unclear and varies both within and between studies, which together poses challenges when interpreting study findings and deriving practical recommendations regarding the influence of resistance training proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy and other short-term responses. Based on limited available evidence, performing resistance training to set failure is likely not superior to non-failure resistance training to maximize muscle hypertrophy, but the optimal proximity to failure in resistance training for muscle hypertrophy is unclear and may be moderated by other resistance training variables, such as load and volume load. Also, resistance training performed to set failure likely induces greater neuromuscular fatigue, muscle damage, and perceived discomfort than non-failure resistance training, which may negatively influence resistance training performance, post-resistance training recovery, and long-term adherence. Here we have a study challenging the last two. Low-load resistance training performed to muscle failure or near muscle failure does not promote additional gains on muscle strength, hypertrophy, and functional performance of older adults. This study here, the effects of resistance training to near failure on strength, hypertrophy, and motor unit adaptations in previously trained adults. From the Physiological Society. Using 0 to 1 RIR versus 4 to 6 RIR following each set promotes similar increases in strength. A recent report by Refalo et al. Indicates that performing an acute bout of resistance exercise at or close to failure leads to poorer post-exercise recovery and worsened muscle soreness and general feelings of well-being compared to higher RIR training. Hence, high RIR training is seemingly an effective method for increasing strength in recreational trained individuals during a 5 to 6 week training block while not overtaxing the trainee. However, low RIR training seemingly increases the firing rates of earlier recruited motor units, and further research is needed to determine whether this training adaptation has practical relevance. Now, here is the granddaddy meta-regression that seemed to re-spark this debate and gave tons of TikTokers everywhere a bunch of fucking shit to sling at people like Schoenfeld or any other fitness influencer or researcher that said you do not need to train to failure all the time, even though that is kind of misrepresenting what a lot of these smart and fully accoladed people have been saying for years, but we'll touch on that in a second. Exploring the dose-response relationship between estimated resistance training proximity to failure, strength gain, and muscle hypertrophy, a series of meta-regressions. Now, you can go find this paper for free. It is massive and massive and massive and massive and massive. Here's the big graphic that's been getting thrown around the most. On the y-axis here, we have proportion of estimated effect size in percentage. And on the x-axis, we have estimated proximity to failure. The red line is strength, the blue line is hypertrophy. Strength gains increase negligibly as sets are terminated farther from failure. The slope of RIR is further modified by load, as training with lighter loads results in even greater strength gains farther from failure. Load-mediated rather than intraset fatigue-mediated decreases in RIR may be preferred to optimize strength gains. For hypertrophy, we have changes in muscle size increase non-linearly as sets are terminated closer to failure. The slope of RIR is further modified by load, as training with heavier loads results in less of an advantage of training closer to failure. Groups training to failure with involuntary set termination saw favorable outcomes compared to those that did not. Here is the big part that all of these people love to miss whenever they want to misrepresent their studies. Researchers and practitioners should be cautious interpreting the findings of the present analysis, as proximity to failure was estimated and its accuracy cannot be confirmed. The same argument the training to failure camp loved to impose on all past studies that said that training to failure is not required for maximizing hypertrophy is now being used against them, but they don't want to hear it. Now, rather than go over this entire study, I'm going to play some clips from someone who is much smarter than me and does a great job at breaking me down. Shout out Lane Norton. Everyone go subscribe. Check out BioLane, all that stuff.
A new study published. The first author on it is actually my coach for powerlifting, Zach Robinson. One of his other partners in his company, Data Driven Strength, Josh Pellin, also was on the paper. And it was examining the relationship between training to failure or proximity from failure and how that affects strength and hypertrophy. What was interesting about this study is they used a meta-regression, which basically, if you have enough data, you can kind of use it to project out and fit kind of a curve. Essentially, it can show you a graphic model of what the relationship appears to look like. And they found some really interesting results, and I think people have been misinterpreting them. So let's start with the strength data because it's a little bit more straightforward. And it may be a little bit counterintuitive to what you have come to believe. So what they found was that at a given load, training proximity to failure doesn't appear to matter that much. Why is that? That may seem odd. When you're training to failure or close to failure, you're going to have a lot of intraset fatigue. So as you approach failure, you're going to be more fatigued. It appears to be a relatively flat relationship between the proximity from failure and the effects on strength. Now, some people might say, well, then why ever train heavy? Well, you do need to train heavy if you want to get strong, because strength expression is a specific skill. And training heavy helps with that skill. But let's look at, like, say, an RPE8 single, which would also be an RIR of 2. So RIR and RPE are basically the same thing, but they're just inverse. So an RIR of 1 is an RPE of 9, RIR of 2, RPE8, RIR of 3, RPE7, and so on and so forth. So when we look at like a single at an RPE8 or RIR of 2, that means you could have done 3 reps with that weight. That is far less overall fatiguing than a set of 8 at an RIR of 2, meaning you could have done 10 total reps, but you would build up significantly more intraset fatigue going up to that number. And since it will have to be a lighter weight, you're probably not going to build as much strength doing that. And so I actually called Zach, who is my coach, to ask him about this study. And his words were that it appears that at a given load, it matters less how close you get to failure. But it is important to use heavy loads if you want to get strong. They found something interesting when it came to hypertrophy, which typically what the recommendations have been is you don't need to train to failure, you just need to get close to failure. What they found with this model is it actually showed the best results with training to failure. And in fact, there seemed to be an inflection point around the RIR1, RIR2, where they started getting even better results than, say, RIR3 or 4. Now, this has led people to say, see, you should take every single set to failure, and anything else is a waste of time. That's not what this data says, and I asked Zach that exact question, and he said the first thing to understand is we had to estimate these RIRs and RPEs, because in many of these studies, they weren't reported. So we were using things like velocity loss and other models in order to estimate the RIR. But in many of these studies, it was not directly measured. So that's one drawback of the study. It's not a knock on the study because it's a meta-analysis, meta-regression. You have to estimate these things if the authors didn't report them. Zach's words were, this has not completely changed my opinion on training to failure, but it has shifted it a little bit. So he said he does think it's important to get really close to failure, if not get to failure on occasion, but he doesn't think this data means you need to train to failure on every set. And there's a few different reasons for that. One, if you're training to failure on every set, it's going to be very fatiguing, difficult to recover from, and your subsequent sessions may not be good. Now, him and I discussed it, and we do think that this also applies exercise specificity, meaning if you're going to train to failure, you're better off doing that on things like say for lower body, leg extensions, leg curls, things that you can train to failure on every set, but it's not super fatiguing. Whereas when you start getting up into compound movements, training to absolute failure is going to be much more fatiguing overall. And the research data does suggest that on compound movements, because you can use an overall greater load, you can get similar or same benefits as training to failure while not training quite to failure. Now, what I will say is I think this data suggests that it probably is important to get close to failure. So Zach said, previously he would tell people, if you want hypertrophy, 2, 3 RIR. Now he's saying, 0 to 2, right? So he shifted it a little bit up. I would say I still think if you're doing compound lifts, the vast majority, probably around an RIR of 2, maybe 1. If you're going to go really close to failure or to failure on a compound lift, make it your last set of that exercise. The other sets you can go kind of close, but on the last set, go to absolute failure if you want, because then you're not creating a bunch of fatigue on the front end that's going to negatively impact subsequent sets. When it comes to compound movements, maybe using failure a little bit more sparingly, saving it for the last set of a given exercise, and then saving most of your sets where you're training to failure for your isolation exercises.
There you have it. One of the best fitness influencers, if you can even call Lane Norton that because he's a legitimate researcher, contacted the fucking researcher who was the spearhead of that study these people love to reference, and even he states that training to failure is not necessary and isn't always warranted. So after all of this, it's time for me to give my personal and maybe a bit brain dead conclusions, as well as my attempts at offering some practical applications for you, an everyday gym bro. Training to failure is an effective and efficient way to make sure you got a good workout in. If you love training to failure, that's what gets you in the gym, that's what makes you excited. Go for it. Just keep in mind you may have to deload more often, especially depending on your level of volume and intensity and your recovery protocols. It does impose a much larger hit to your recovery debt than other forms of training. That being said, it does not seem to be that much more critical to hit failure from a hypertrophy or especially strength standpoint. Training with an RIR of 2 or even an RPE of 8 for most sets seems to elicit the same amount of hypertrophy as training to failure, especially when you consider the fact that you'll have to deload less often, you won't build up as much systemic fatigue and everything else. You'll also get in more quality sets, which is very important because we know that volume is going to be the main driver of hypertrophy if you are less fatigued in your first few sets. You just get more quality work in. If you really want to cross your I's and dot your T's, you can hit failure on your very last set. To be extra safe, I typically recommend to only hit true failure on your very last set of your very last movement for that muscle group. Meaning if you have 3 chest movements, say a flat barbell bench, an inclined dumbbell bench, and then a cable crossover, you would approach failure on all of your main sets. And then for that final set, on cable crossover, which is your last movement for chest that day, feel free to hit true failure there. And if you want to, even throw in some stuff like drop sets or a superset of some sort, or stretching in between sets, or partials, or anything else to really drive home that failure point. Remember, it's just momentary failure, but feel free to either go to mechanical failure or absolute failure or whatever weird definition you find in the literature out there. People seem to be pretty bad at knowing where failure is. So I think now and then it's also very important to go to complete failure just so you know where that is for you on any given day. It's also a good way to track your progression without having to do something like a 1-rep max, which for the vast majority of us only serves to fuel our ego. This is exactly what most of the giant researchers have recommended for the longest time. Train somewhat close to failure and occasionally hit it if you want to, and occasionally hit it just to see how far you've come. But yet all these people want to shit on these researchers for it, even though it literally agrees with the study they now want to reference. So as per usual, train however the fuck you want to. Just don't then use some misplaced and half-true dogma to shit on someone else's style of training. Training close to failure seems to be just as effective as training to failure. Training to failure is probably more efficient as far as when you're speaking in terms of time spent in the gym, with the downside being that you may have to take more time away from the gym in order to ensure proper recovery. We need more research, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much like anything else I've covered on my channel. Do what you want to do. Stop making mountains out of molehills. And guys, that is the video. If you like this style of content, do me a favor. Hit the like button if you like it. Leave me a comment why I'm an idiot, why you love it. I respond to every single one, and it really helps out the channel. Make sure you subscribe because I post a new video every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so you want to get notified when it comes out. And then also share to a buddy. If you really like this style of content, you can follow all of these socials. They've been on screen throughout the entire thing. They will be linked down below in the description. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.